Later this morning, New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg and others on Capitol Hill to testify on the 9/11 Commission recommendations. After that, some of the House debate from this week on minimum wage, stem cell research, and prescription drugs. Right now, Washington Journal.
Welcome to the Washington Journal for Saturday, January 13th. We'll get your thoughts on if the government should negotiate drug prices under Medicare in the first 30 minutes of our program. And then Judith Yaffe of National Defense University will join us to discuss about the president's Iraq plan, especially how the al-Maliki government will do in meeting the demands that were set by the president this week. In an hour and 15 minutes from now, we'll host a roundtable discussion on the federal funding for stem cell research. Two guests will be with us. Dr. Stephen Teitelbaum of Washington University School of Medicine will also be joined by Dr. David Prentice of the Family Research Council. In our last hour, we will start by looking at a Supreme Court case this week that considered how teacher unions spend their dues on political activities. Andrew Trotter of Education Week will be our guest. And then in our final half hour this morning, Leslie Harris of the Center for Democracy and Technology joins us to discuss how the government searches online databases for information on combating terrorism while at the same time preserving information privacy. She testified on the topic this week. Yesterday, House Democrats passed a bill that would require the government to negotiate with drug companies for medicines purchased under Medicare's prescription drug program. We want to get your thoughts on if the government should be involved in this activity. Here are the lines: 202-737-0002 for Democrats, 202-737-0001 for Republicans, 202-628-0205 for independents. Again, should the federal government involve itself in negotiating drug prices with prescription drug companies? You probably saw that debate just before we went to the show today. Chris Mondix and Tom Ginsburg of the Philadelphia Inquirer have a write-up of what happened yesterday. Here's the headline: House OK's Medicare drug bill. They write that saying that they would lower drug costs for seniors, House Democrats yesterday passed a bill that would require the government to negotiate with drug firms for medicines bought under the Medicare prescription drug program. If enacted, the bill would mark the first major revision to the Medicare drug program passed in late 2003, but the measure, which passed by a vote of 255 to 170, faces huge hurdles, with the White House and key senators expressing disapproval. Quote, if this bill is presented to the president, he will veto it, White House Press Secretary Tony Snow said yesterday. Democrats were undeterred, insisting that the government would save money by negotiating directly with the industry. And again, that's the topic of our discussion this morning. So if you want to call in and make your thoughts known on it, the numbers will be on your screen. They all start with a 202 area code. We've divided them by party for this segment. Again, it's 202-737-0002 for Democrats, 202-737-0001 for Republicans, and 202-628-0205 for independents. And they will stay up. We'll read a little bit more from the paper, though, this morning, this article from the Philadelphia Inquirer. The authors write that over intense Democratic opposition, House Republicans pushed through legislation in late 2003 committing the government to pay a large portion of prescription drug costs for seniors and the disabled starting in January of 2006. Dozens of insurers now compete for government contracts to provide the benefit, then negotiate with drug firms over price. Democrats say the federal government could use its muscle to lower the drug prices. The bill would require Health and Human Services Secretary Michael Leavitt to negotiate directly with companies for drugs offered through the program. But there is some debate on whether the prices would plummet. A Congressional Budget Office report this week concluded that the measure probably would not work better than the current system because it bars the government from establishing a so-called formulary, a list of approved drugs. If it cannot choose among medications, the government would lack bargaining power, the CBO said. And some analysts doubt whether Leavitt's agency has the expertise to negotiate prices for the thousands of drugs involved. To your calls, Rio Grande, Texas. Good morning. You're first. Rio Grande, Texas. Go ahead. One more time for Rio Grande. Good morning. Good morning. Go ahead.
Hello?
Hi, caller. Go ahead.
Yes. This is calling from Miami, Florida. Hello?
On, sir.
Yes.
You are on, sir. Go ahead.
I'm on the TV now?
Yes, sir, you are. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm a physician here in Miami, Florida. I think it's important that we control these drug costs because many of our people are coming in and are unable to afford the drugs that are best for them, and these are the manufacturer's drugs, and I think we have to try and provide the drugs so the patients can benefit, especially antihypertensive medication and many of these drugs that lower the risk factors. It is a serious problem, and I'm sure that the drug companies are important, that they do research, but something has to be done to benefit the people that are struggling to control their illnesses.
Is the government qualified to do that, in your opinion?
I think they are. We fund the research nationally, the National Institute of Health, and they provide access to billions of dollars that advance health care, and it is an important aspect that the government can do, and I think there's much duplication in the drug industry. There's Me Too drugs that come on, and if there's a way to bring on the most effective drugs on a national basis, everyone would benefit.
Somerset, Kentucky. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to give my word on this thing. I'm a senior, and I have quite a few health problems, and my medication runs about $200 a month. Well, on this drug program, it costs me about $12 a month. I don't draw that much, but and me and my wife both is retired. But she is not eligible for it and won't be for about a year, so she has to get samples and everything else from the doctor the best way she can. But I hope they leave this thing alone because they can talk about the donut hole. When I got in the donut hole, my prescriptions was $2 a piece, and I take about 8 of them, so it run me about $16 a month. So I hope to goodness they leave this thing alone. I can't see them trying to fix something. I don't really believe we've got any problem with this.
That was Somerset, Kentucky. Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Yes, good morning. It's strange having the time difference. Anyway, I wanted to call because I'm not only a young disabled widow, but I've been dealing with Medicare since 1997, and I only had any kind of prescription benefits from my husband's businesses. When he was alive, he died of pancreatic cancer in February, and I tell you, the donut hole, the only way I got away from the donut hole was because of the federal subsidy. I had to file mountains of paperwork to try to keep my head above water here. And let me tell you, without this, the drug plan, with that donut hole, it would have cost me $3,500 I didn't have. But because I'm on federal subsidy, I didn't have to deal with that.
So we're talking about the government's negotiating for lower drug prices. Bring your thoughts to that.
Well, if they can lower the drug prices for everybody else, that would be great. Now, my drug prices have been really fabulous. Like the caller before said, I've been only paying, my prescriptions were over $1,200 a month, and now they're only about $3 or $4 a month. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm a little worried about the government getting involved in it because they've been screwing up so much. But I've been watching them debate, and I've been watching the Republicans are being petulant children. They're not allowing, they're trying to do the same thing to the Democrats they've been doing. I've been watching this since my husband died. I've had way too much time on my hands and watching a lot of C-SPAN. And I watched all of the ridiculous debates that happened when the Democrats stood up and made sense, and the Republicans didn't, and yet the Republicans still passed all their...
Thanks, caller. A couple more stories we'll look at. We'll continue to take your calls on this topic if you want to call the numbers on the screen. But the Associated Press reports that Representative John Doolittle of California said yesterday that he will no longer employ his wife as his campaign fundraiser, an arrangement that allowed her to collect a 15% cut of the donations to his campaign and political action committees. That's more than $100,000 since 2003. Doolittle, who has drawn criticism for links to disgraced lobbyist Jack Abramoff, said he will hire an outside fundraiser. He made the announcement yesterday in a commentary article he distributed to newspapers in his Northern California district, noting his tough battle for re-election. Also in the pages of the Financial Times this morning, Fiona Harvey and Ed Crooks in London write that Sir Nicholas Stern, the author of a significant British government report on climate change, is to visit the U.S. next month to help shape the Democrats' policies on the issue. In Washington, Sir Nicholas, who is head of the UK's government's economic service and a former World Bank chief economist, will talk to Barbara Boxer, incoming chair of the influential Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and other leading Democrats. He will give evidence before a congressional committee led by Senator Jeff Bingaman, who has vowed to bring forward new emissions legislation. Many leading Democrats on Capitol Hill are known to be keen to bring forward legislation this year which would reduce the U.S.'s greenhouse gas emissions, probably through the form of a cap-and-trade system like that enforced in the European Union. They have support of some Republicans, such as Senator John McCain, but there are also strong elements within both parties opposed to mandatory limits on emissions, as in the Bush administration. Back to your calls on if the government should be negotiating drug prices. St. Louis, Missouri.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I think everyone knows that the government can't manage anything. As soon as they get involved, everything goes to pot. They'll start rationing the drugs. People won't know how to get the drugs because some bureaucrat will be telling a physician that that's not the right drug to use, and the drugs will become scarce, and the drug companies will finally say forget about it because we don't want to be involved in this. And you'll find the same thing you had when you were involved with the vaccinations. The government got involved, and finally the drug companies said forget about it. So I think you'll just have such a mess that it will become unmanageable. And usually what happens when the government gets involved.
Baltimore, Maryland.
Hi, Pedro. I do support this. The government negotiating the prices. I'm on disability myself and take 6 medications a month, 3 of which are brand name drugs, and the 3 in combination cost over $1,100 a month, which is ridiculous. Last year I was very happy with the plan that I had, but the company dropped their coverage for brand name drugs in the gap. So I was looking for a plan this year, and I only found one in the state that will cover my brand name drugs after I go into the donut hole. And it was an unaffordable plan for me. It would have cost $300 a month just for that. So I don't know what I'm going to do because my 3 drugs don't have a generic equivalent, and other drugs that are available as generics are much less effective. The other thing is in regard to what the gentleman from St. Louis just said, each one of the drug plans now have their own formularies. So unless you can find a plan that has all of your medications, or if you only take a few, you may be okay. But the way the Medicare bill is written, if your formulary doesn't include your drugs, you don't, even if you pay out of pocket, that doesn't count towards your out-of-pocket costs in getting out of the donut hole. So that's a problem. So I do support the government negotiating prices with the proviso that the consumers benefit from the discount, because I'd like to see that there's something that won't prevent the insurance companies from pocketing the discount themselves. I wouldn't put that past them at all.
Okay, caller, thank you very much. El Paso, Texas.
Good morning.
Morning.
I really don't know what to say about this because, first of all, the whole drug benefit is totally unconstitutional. There's nothing in the Constitution that warrants any of this, and I defy anyone to point to any place in the Constitution that does. But since we have this nonsense, of course, there's got to be some kind of curb on the prices that are charged on the drugs, especially in the donut hole. My poor mother was just devastated by that. Okay, I would like to make a proposal, if I could. From now on, whenever you have a guest on that discusses any kind of bill, any kind of legislation whatsoever, the first question I think you should ask is, would you please show me in the Constitution where the Constitution warrants what you're doing?
Caller, thanks. Well, we'll leave it at that. On our Newsmakers program that's coming up on Sunday, we were joined by Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma, also the National Republican Campaign Committee Chair. One of the things he talked about during the course of his conversation was looking at Republican presidential candidates for 2008.
One job in electing somebody president, isn't it? It's making sure that the president I hope we elect has a Republican majority to work with. You know, frankly, I think we've got a very good candidate field. I know most of them. I know most of the political people that are involved in their various campaigns. You know, I think it's going to be a very competitive Republican nominating process. I think that's good for us. It generates a lot of activity and visibility. And again, I think you can just look at the climate, and 2008 is going to be, in my opinion, a sort of wither America election. The House is in play, the Senate's in play, the presidency is open. There's not a legacy candidate like a vice president there. It ought to be as intense and as interesting as possible. And that generates high turnout. That high turnout is going to come in those 60 seats like every place else in America. So the presidential campaign, I think, is almost certainly going to work to our advantage in the House.
And that's on our Newsmakers program. That is tomorrow. You can catch it 2 times, 10 a.m. and again at 6 p.m. There's also a story in the papers, according to the Associated Press, one of the several interviews that President Ford did before his death. Here's the headline. Now it can be told how Ford rated his fellow presidents. It's out of Grand Rapids. He says that the author says that in 25 years of interviews with his hometown paper that could be released only upon his death, former President Gerald Ford once called Jimmy Carter, quote, a disaster who ranked alongside Warren G. Harding, and said Ronald Reagan received far too much credit for ending the Cold War. Quote, it makes me very irritated when Reagan's people pound their chests and say that because we had this big military buildup, the Kremlin collapsed, Ford told the Grand Rapids Press. Ford said the best president in his lifetime was a more moderate Republican, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Harry Truman, quote, would get very high marks for his handling of foreign crises, Ford said. Ford also praised his predecessor Richard Nixon as a foreign policy master despite the Watergate scandal that drove him from office. Ford considered John F. Kennedy overrated and Bill Clinton average. He admired George H.W. Bush's handling of the 1991 Persian Gulf War and had mixed opinions of Carter, who defeated Ford in 1976. According to the newspaper, Ford declined to rate George W. Bush, saying he did not know him well enough. Berry Hill, Oklahoma. Should the government be negotiating drug prices?
Yes, they should. For years, we've all traveled to Yuma, Arizona. My family, my wife's family, and my father-in-law for years have went across the border to Mexico and negotiated our own drugs. And you got about 300,000 snowbirds that go down every year and buy all the prescription drugs at 75 to 80% off from the Mexican pharmacy. And some of the stuff is a little bit newer version of what the FDA allows Americans to use. And I haven't had any. There's not been any negative. I've not had any deaths or any illness of taking internationally produced medicine. I think we should go international for our drug prices, and then we should have them built, make it just like the same standards the FDA requires. If it's good enough for Walmart and good enough for everybody else to go to China, I think China should be making all of our pharmacy stuff for 75 to 100% off or 99% off.
Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Hi. I think they should. And because as a person who is living with HIV, I am HIV positive. I believe that, the prices of drugs to stay alive right now is very, very costly. Let's deal with, nobody never wants to deal with, people who are HIV positive. I believe that we should pay, a less price to, help us stay alive.
How much do you spend on a monthly basis?
What's that?
How much do you spend on a monthly basis?
I believe it's like $2,000 to $3,000. It costs a lot of money to stay alive. I personally don't pay for it, but I had to pay a co-pay of $3 every time, but the state pays for my medical, and I believe the actual drug costs $14,000.
And you pay how much?
I believe it's $14,000.
And how much do you pay again?
My copay is $3 every time that I go to refill my
prescription.
Caller, thanks. A couple of international stories. This is from the London Times, a speech that the British Prime Minister Tony Blair made. Philip Webster writes that Tony Blair responded yesterday to growing pressure from military commanders by accepting that more money would have to be spent on the armed forces to improve their conditions, equipment, and enable Britain to remain a war-fighting power. In a lecture defending his policy of interventionism, the Prime Minister said that the new challenges from worldwide terrorism required new commitments to be made to the forces. On another page to this story, Philip Webster writes that retreating in the face of a terrorist enemy would be a catastrophe, Mr. Blair said. Terrorism could not be defeated by military means alone, but it could not be defeated without it. In remarks that could have also been aimed in the direction of Gordon Brown, he added that poverty in Africa could not be solved by the presence of aid. It also needed the absence of conflict, and failed states threatened other countries as well as their own people. Alan Cowell writes in the New York Times this morning, looking at some international reaction to the president's speech this week. The headline says, in Europe and elsewhere, Bush's new war strategy is greeted with skepticism. It quotes some of the responses, saying, quote, "It hasn't changed anything," said Bernard Bot, the Dutch foreign minister whose country withdrew its troop from the Iraq coalition in 2005. Others painted their analogies in a more apocalyptic hue. In France, the newspaper Le Monde, which after the September 11th attacks had declared "We are all Americans," published a cartoon depicting President Bush as a bulldozer driver shoveling American soldiers into a ditch in the shape of Iraq. In Germany, according to a paper there, quote, "Bush hopes to douse the Iraqi fire with the blood of Americans." And this is a story in the New York Times. The Washington Post has a Canadian reaction to changes in passport rules. This is Doug Struck writing that starting on January 23rd, the airline passengers landing in the United States will have to carry a passport, not just the driver's license and birth certificate that can now be used by Canadians crossing the border and by U.S. citizens returning from Canada, Mexico, the Bahamas, and the Caribbean. The result has been a brisk business at passport offices here in the United States. Applications for passports are up 53% in the United States and 33% in Canada from the previous year. Santa Barbara, California.
Yes. I've had some experience with Medicare, and I've been a caregiver for elderly people, and I am amazed when anyone complains about their care from Medicare, their co-payments. I mean, an example is the gentleman that called who gets $2,000 worth of prescriptions for $3. I mean, what kind of a better deal than that could you get? I feel that the government is putting this burden on younger people who probably won't be able to afford anything, whereas we're spending so much money on people in the end stages of their lives to actually prolong lives that some of them would just rather not even bother with. You know, they're not happy, they don't feel like they're contributing anything, and yet some of them hang on by their fingernails. And I also have noticed that anything that Medicare provides, they will take, usually, like hip replacements, even though they haven't walked for years, but they won't spend their own money to go to the dentist and have their teeth fixed. And these are people who actually have, you know, the resources to do it, but they will let the government pay for it.
Okay, caller. Thank you. We have to move on. Kokomo, Indiana.
I think the government should interfere. My one drug I took for sodium, when I went to renew it about a month or two ago, went up from $749 and some cents to $849. And there was no excuse for it raising. And then the inhaler I used for my asthma went up $100 when the drugs thing went in effect. So I think the government should check it out and interfere. Thank you.
On Q&A, Melanie Barnes of the Center for American Progress is our guest, and one of the things she talked about was voting rights.
How important was the Voting Rights Act of 1992?
I think it's incredibly important. It's a piece of legislation that we passed to deal with the issue of helping people who are language minorities. So people who are citizens, obviously, have the right to vote, but for them, English isn't necessarily their first language, or they may not have a written language that's their first language. So how do we make sure that they have the necessary resources when they go to vote so that they can vote and participate in our democracy? And we were reauthorizing that, and as you can imagine, anytime you take the Voting Rights Act and language issues, there's a lot of debate, but we got that piece of legislation passed. And one of the things I remember is getting letters from people and clippings from people from around the country saying, this is how you helped our community. And you know, that's the kind of thing, that's why this work is something that I care about so passionately.
Melanie Barnes, our guest on Q&A. That program you can see tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the evening, the rebroadcast at 11 o'clock. If you go to our C-SPAN website, you can find out more about her and the conversation that takes place on the Q&A program. Back to your calls, Weymouth, Massachusetts. Good morning. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm an old Korean veteran from way back, and I was wondering, I got this Medicare, and it's been costing me about $1,000 a year. And going to veterans, through co-payments, I accumulated about $800 worth of co-payments. You know, some were even $100 co-payment at one time. So I turned this into Medicare, figured maybe where I've been paying in this Medicare, maybe they would kick into it. I'm not really hurting on money, but I thought, you know, just the idea of would they pay anything? Well, they sent me a letter saying they will not pay something like that from one government agency to another. Well, I didn't think it was fair in that sense, you know, because I thought that if a person's paid into an insurance setup, it should take care of it. But they refused it, and I just thought it wasn't right.
So what should the government do about the future of drug prices then?
Well, I think that if somebody's paying into the Medicare, that, you know, they should cover something out of it, you know, not from taking the, you know, paying the whole thing like they've been doing. This other thing on this 80%, they claim they cover 80% of mostly all their coverage. Well, these co-payments, I mean, these insurance companies that are handling the excess of that, 20%, they're charging twice as much as it would cost you on the 80%. I said, it never made sense to me, you know, how they figured this thing out.
Caller, thanks a lot. The Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, is heading to the Middle East with meetings with several heads of state over there. She made comments in Ireland recently to the Associated Press. They write that Americans' skeptical view of the Iraq war won't change until they see progress there, but the United States won't, quote, pull the plug on the conflict, Secretary of State Rice said. Rice would not detail any backup strategy if President Bush's new plan to turn around the war comes up short, or if the Iraq government fails to hold up its end. And also in the papers today, a story looking at two cases that have been added to the Supreme Court docket dealing with the death penalty and tobacco. Robert Barnes writes that a federal appeals court overturned the trial judge's ruling in a rape and murder trial in the state of Washington. One of the issues in the case is whether federal courts should defer to a trial judge who is in a position to actually talk to and observe a potential juror in making the decision about his ability to carry out the law. And a couple of columns over, Robert Burns writes about the other case being considered. It's the cigarette case Watson v. Philip Morris. Comes from Arkansas, where consumers allege that the company had violated the state's deceptive anti-advertising law with claims about its, quote, light cigarettes. Similar class action lawsuits have been filed around the country, but Philip Morris, whose parent company is now known as Altria Group Incorporated, was successful in having the case transferred to federal courts, saying that its advertising is regulated by the Federal Trade Commission and that it made a, quote, person acting under a federal officer. And those stories in the Washington Post. Back to your calls. Loughton, Oklahoma.
Good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN. I last year was paying $16 to my insurance company for Part D. It went up to $21 this year. So yesterday in Congress, we heard all this baloney about how the Part D insurance companies have not raised their prices for their premiums. That's not true. Number two, I go to Walmart because I can get my generics for $4. Also, I think that you should investigate how many congressmen are getting funds from prescription people for their campaigns. And I want to thank you for C-SPAN.
In the Washington Times, on its front page, Charles Hurt writes that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi yesterday said Democrats will close a loophole in the House-passed minimum wage increase that exempts American Samoa, an action taken after it was revealed that one of the U.S. territory's main employers is based in her congressional district. Quote, I have asked the Education and Labor Committee as they go forward with the legislation to make sure that all of the territories have to comply with U.S. law on minimum wage, Mrs. Pelosi said. The decision follows criticism over the exemption reported earlier this week by the Washington Times to allow tuna canneries in American Samoa to continue paying $3.26 an hour, nearly $4 less than the $7.25 minimum wage passed by the House on Wednesday. Last call on the topic on if the federal government should be negotiating drug prices. Arlington, Texas.
Yeah, Pedro. I have a couple points here. I believe that the federal government should negotiate on behalf of Medicare people. I mean, look at the buying power. That give you, 40, 50 million people. The other point is with this globalization that we have, with all these open markets, you have to figure that around the world that there are people that suffer from the same maladies that Americans do. And those people are paying what they can afford for those drugs. And these big companies are multinational. These big pharmaceutical companies are multinational. And you don't hear about any large number of deaths over a particular drug. I mean, unless it's something like Vioxx you hear about. So what I don't get is why we're not on the global market thing here where we can get the lowest possible prices from the pharmaceuticals. It's because Congress and the pharmaceutical companies have a deal to keep Americans in a little box so they can charge us the highest prices in the world for drugs. Thank you.
We thank you for all the comments made during this half hour. We have another way of having your input involved in the conversations that we have every morning. It's called our Viewfinder. And what we ask you to do is shoot a short video message and to have America respond to it. This time we're looking for you to tell us who your favorite president is. Let us know who you feel has had the most impact, who has done most for the United States, and what qualities they also possess that makes you think that they are your favorite. Now, what we ask you to do is record a short video of yourself answering the question, who's your favorite president? And if you would, keep that video to a minute or less, please. And then upload it to our Viewfinder, which is on our C-SPAN website. Again, if you could, keep those comments short so we can get a lot of people involved in the conversation. When you go to the website in our Viewfinder section, it'll give you all the information that you need to upload the video. That's at cspan.org, c-span.org, and it will fully explain on how to do that. Again, we plan to use those comments that register with the Viewfinder program over the President's Weekend. That's coming up close. And if you would, go ahead and send those videos starting today, so that we can put them together and give you an opportunity to share your viewpoint on various issues on this program. Coming up, we're going to talk about the President's plan for Iraq, specifically the government of Iraq and their capability of meeting the demands that were met by laid down by the President this week. Judith Yaffe of the National Defense University will be our guest, and she'll be up right next.
Here's a look at the guests and topics to be discussed on this weekend's news and public affairs shows. This week, we'll host National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley and Democratic Representative John Murtha. Both will address the President's plan for Iraq. California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger will discuss his agenda for 2007. Republican Senator John McCain and Democratic Senator Barack Obama will appear on Face the Nation. The topic, the plan for Iraq. On Meet the Press, National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley. 4 senators will also appear on the program, Democratic Senators Christopher Dodd and Joe Lieberman, as well as Republican Senators John Kyle and Chuck Hagel. Fox News Sunday hosts Vice President Dick Cheney. And on Late Edition, Iraqi Foreign Minister Hoshyar Zebari, Pakistani Prime Minister Shaukat Aziz, and former Joint Chiefs Chairman General Richard Myers. Also on the show, Republican Senator Mitch McConnell and Democratic Senators Carl Levin and John Kerry. You can listen to the re-airs of these programs every Sunday beginning at noon Eastern Time on C-SPAN Radio.
Former Arkansas Governor Republican Mike Huckabee, Sunday, on C-SPAN's Road to the White House 2008. Governor Huckabee speaks on his career, his potential run for the presidency, and his new book, From Hope to Higher Ground, 12 Stops to Restoring America's Greatness. Governor Mike Huckabee, Sunday at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. on C-SPAN's Road to the White House 2008. Road to the White House is also available as a C-SPAN podcast.